Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. I hope you had a great Labor Day and that your September is off to a wonderful start. Beginning our broadcast, and dealing with severe weather is just par for the course when you live in Nebraska. You can always count on a hailstorm or two, and this year was no different. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Nebraska Extension's Dr. Justin McMechan to learn how producers can help their fields recover from hail damage.
Whether it's herbicides for weeds, pesticides for insects, or fungicide for disease, there are many ways a producer can prevent damage to their crops. But when it comes to Mother Nature, prevention is not an option. That's why Nebraska Extension's Justin McMechan researches hail and its effects on crops so producers can be better advised on what to do after the storm.
So the machine behind me is actually one that was built off of one in 1986 by Dale Flowerday, who recently passed away. But Dale produced a machine that was good for demonstration purposes and got the initial work on hail that really needed to be done. This machine is a scale up from that. Mike Kosher helped build this machine, and so we were able to dial between 60 mile per hour winds and 170, which is a class 5 hurricane. We don't have a lot of those in Nebraska, but we could pick any speed we wanted to within that. And then it has the ability to monitor all those functions as we use the machine. So recording wind speed, recording all kinds of ice flow rate, things that allow repeatability to occur. You see a lot of variation in hail damage. That's the reality of a real scenario, and in particular for reproductive stage corn, the damage to those ears associated with hail. So it just gives our clientele an opportunity to see what is as close to a real situation as possible. And biggest thing, take out the shock and awe that happens with hail, right? It's kind of like I've lost my entire crop. Not necessarily.
When it's time for an insurance claims adjuster to visit the damaged fields, Justin says there are key things they look for to determine how much is actually lost and a few things growers can spot for themselves.
Yeah, they're going to be looking at plant stand, viable plant stand that's out there. They'll do that far into the reproductive stages of soybeans. The charts that they're using will differ, and the production loss will differ because of that. Leaf defoliation, that happens in every hail scenario we get. Then they'll be looking at how many nodes are cut off on that plant and are remaining relative to what should have been there. And then they'll also be looking at how many leaves are lost on that plant. Some complicating things that might frustrate growers is the amount of stem damage, and you can see that today there's a lot of stem damage even on the old hail that we've did a couple weeks ago. And for growers that can be frustrating because it's how, is that plant going to have standability later? But in some cases an adjuster might defer the evaluation if they're fearful the crop may lodge as a result of the hail injury that occurred.
While replanting may be an option earlier in the season, it's not viable in the late season. Justin says the best thing to do is business as usual.
Yeah, late season we're obviously out of the chance to do any replants on anything like that, so they're looking at managing an existing crop that's been hailed. Part of that management will exist on what's the yield potential that's left. Maybe I was planning on putting on a fungicide, my crop yield's been reduced, other things like that. May want to tone down some of those decisions because we may not have as much productivity left in that field. But it really becomes about maintaining that crop. And the National Crop Insurance Service requires you to maintain the crop unless it's completely written off. And so they'll ask you to keep doing the same management or at least consistent management practices to maintain that crop. The biggest thing is wait. If you rush out and try and make decisions, especially early season when there's a lot of potential, you can spend a lot of money when there was still a crop there that would have performed fairly well. That's a hard thing for a grower to hear when the replant takes time, money, they've got to source it, and every day they wait, the yield production of the replant decreases because of the date of planting. But I guarantee them it's going to pay off to wait and make a true assessment of that crop.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
We've got a link to more of Justin's research and ways to learn more about hail-damaged crops. That's on the Market Journal website. And with harvest season on the horizon, Maddie also checked in with Nebraska Extension's Dr. Tamra Jackson-Ziems on what corn growers can expect when it comes to late season diseases.
Well, we're on the tail end of the season now, and we've had a very unusual and stressful year on this crop, and a lot of moisture throughout the season, and especially here at the end, and cooler temperatures. And so we've seen development of a few ear rot diseases already, just starting, some not widespread just yet, but it's worth watching for those because we want to know what's out in that field so that you can make plans at harvest on how you might handle that grain. And if you have a high incidence of ear rot diseases, know that those fungi will continue to grow in the bin, or they can, and that it might mean making sure that it's a bit drier before it goes in, and maybe not planning to store affected grain as long as you would some of the healthier grain, because some of that will have a big impact on grain quality later on.
This late in the season, there's not much to do in terms of treatment, but Nebraska Extension is always here to help.
At this point, we're in dent in most areas, past that, and so there's no recommended treatment at this time for either Physoderma brown spot in the field or for the ear rot diseases. I recommend if people need help identifying diseases or any other plant problems to contact us at the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic and submitting a sample for diagnosis. That'll also help them plan for management of diseases next year and the following years with hybrid selection, for instance.
On our website, you can find more information on the diagnostic clinic that Tamra mentioned, including how to submit a sample. Next week, Maddie talks with Tamra about Physoderma in corn and what you can do about it. Moving on to markets now, and on Wednesday, I was joined by Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners. He offered his take on next week's WASDE report and the market reaction to Hurricane Dorian. But he also says there's a lot to be optimistic about with this year's crop.
You know what, actually for Nebraska is looking really good. I'd say overall, we got off to a good start in a lot of areas. There's some problems up in northeast Nebraska, got a little bit slower, been a little bit drier. I think the best way we'd sum it up is that we're gonna have, a little bit below average bean crop, unfortunately. I think the corn crop is probably gonna be average to a little bit above average. I think the dry land's probably gonna be better than what the irrigated is. I think in some cases, not meaning yield-wise, but just of the potential. So that's what we're seeing, but there's a lot of other states that are very jealous of Nebraska right now.
That's for sure, and you've had a chance to look at the latest Crop Progress report. What are some of your big takeaways there?
Big takeaway is actually just the stage of this corn crop. And the one statistic that stood out that was really surprising is really where the crop is at in regard to the percent dough. There's 17 million acres, over 17 million acres that are not at the dough stage yet. And normally that'd only be about 6.3 million acres. And what's kind of interesting about that, and so let's put this in perspective, it really, for some of that crop, it's going to take, when you're at the dough stage, about 35 days to get to black layer. And black layer is just where we're really kind of safe from the freeze. The other part about that is that even at the dough stage, if we did have a freeze at that point, our yield could be impacted by about 50%. So we're watching that really close. The other thing that we're looking at really close, so Troy, is also the dent stage. The numbers would show that nationally about 41% dented. Now put that in perspective, 5-year average is 63%, and we go all the way back and look at last year and we were way ahead at 73%. That's going to be the 5th slowest as we look back in our records. Now Nebraska's doing a little better. We're at about 54% dent. That compares to the 5-year average of 66%. Last year we were off to a fast pace, so, and that was 70% dented last year. But believe it or not, Nebraska's doing a little better there. We're about the 14th slowest is where we're kind of sitting right now. So not as bad as what it is nationally.
And Jeff, weather always a big story. We've got our eyes on Hurricane Dorian. So as we record this, it's off the eastern coast of Florida, already torn through the Bahamas. So has this storm had any impacts on the markets, and what do you think future impacts could be? Yeah,
and it definitely, it's very important. I mean, and I really, my heart goes out to any of those that have been impacted by this. And, you know, in the path, we've got agriculture coming through, you know, we've got corn and bean production in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and we went in and took a look at how many bushels of production for corn and beans are kind of in the path. And how we kind of find that is that we said, if the area is going to get over 3 inches of rain with some heavier winds, you know, that could have an impact, it could hurt it. So on the bean side, we estimate there's about 33 million bushels in its path and they're able to be impacted. Over on the corn side, it's about 103 million bushels. Now those are some big numbers, and it's really going to be bad if it happens to be your farm or your field that get hits, but unfortunately it's not enough bushels of production to go ahead and cause us to see a change in the market direction.
And then next week, WASDE report. What are some things you're watching for with this latest report?
Yeah, you know, we're keeping a very close eye on the acre side. We think there could be some slight adjustments on the acres, in particular the corn, maybe something from the adjustment and on the harvested acre side. We think that could come in. And the other big thing that we're really watching though is the yield. And something I want to kind of unpack on the yield side is just kind of how the methodology is going to be different in the September report. And in the September report, we'll actually have the objective yield studies. Now last year, between corn, beans, wheat, and cotton, there'd have been, keep in mind, about 4,544 actual plots that they go out in the field and they set those up. That was something that we didn't have in the August report. And that's going to be important because what we're finding is that the crop probably looks pretty good from the road, but as you get in there, it probably doesn't look as good. And so as they get in those fields and they decide where they're going to set up their plot, and that's all random and they've got it set up ahead of time, they're then going to go in and actually do the stand counts. And then they're going to look at the ears. They're going to shuck them back, and depending on how far along they are, they'll look at the rows around, they'll look at the length, and if they're far enough along, if they're all the way to black layer, which there won't be many of those, then they'll physically take those all the way back into the lab and they'll weigh them. Otherwise, they'll just have to kind of estimate what the weight of those ears are. But what's really impressive about what they do on the objective yield side is they'll come back to that same plot, and they'll come back to it again and look at it until actually the harvest is done. And then they'll actually look at, even after it's been harvested, they'll then go out and they'll look at, okay, how much harvest loss was there in the area where the farmer actually combined? So they try to do a really thorough job of getting us a yield, and I think we need those yield numbers, because I think what we've got right now nationally is that the corn yield's too high, and I think in future reports we're going to see that number come down.
Next week, we'll continue our conversation with Jeff. We'll look at marketing opportunities for old crop and new crop. Plus, join us as we look ahead to this month's quarterly grain stocks report. It's time for this week's trivia question now, and this week the topic is the sugar beet. We want to know, how long is the average sugar beet when it's fully grown? Is it 6 inches, 9 inches, 12 inches, or is it 18 inches? Make your guess, and I'll have the answer after Al's forecast. The Nebraska Panhandle's semi-arid climate and higher elevation makes it suited for a multitude of different crops, including sugar beets, field peas, dry edible beans, wheat, and corn. However, one fragrant field off Highway 92 near Melbetta is home to an entirely new crop, mint. Husband and wife Dan and Becky Fitz are growing 30 acres of peppermint. And while it's not a common crop in Nebraska, Dan notes it's grown in southern Idaho, where the climate and growing conditions aren't too different from the Panhandle. Read about the Fitz and their experience growing mint in the September Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And we've got about 2 more weeks of summer, Al. How's the forecast looking?
You're exactly right, Troy. Here we are, beginning of September, getting into the fall period. We are going to see temperatures that are going to swing both on the positive and negative side of normal. It's very common for this time of the year. In fact, it's very common for us to see several days of cool and several days of warm, and now extended long streaks of warm weather. So we should expect this transition to basically unfold as we would expect. The biggest question is, will we stay warm enough to escape most of the significant freeze damage that everybody's been talking about? I will have an update in Crop Watch next week, and I encourage you to visit the Crop Watch website to see what the latest statistics are, but overall the Panhandle has decreased their freeze probabilities very significantly due to the warmer than normal August temperatures, and we're basically somewhere within plus or minus 5% to 10%, depending on the location of where the statistics lie in the 1st of August. So no real major changes. It does look like we've eased up on some of the frost concerns, at least for the western 1/3 of the state. More importantly, as we look at the upper pattern, we basically have a little trough that's moving through with a broader trough working into the western United States. So this should touch off some thunderstorm activity across the state today, as we have a low pressure developing in southwestern Kansas, bringing the Gulf moisture toward the north. The biggest interest is going to be where does the activity itself develop. Most of it's forecast for the Dakotas, but I think we may see this slip a little bit farther into northern Nebraska. As we get into tomorrow, we see that trough starting to progress into the central Rockies. That's going to eject out some energy into eastern Colorado as we see a surface low starting to develop, and that will lift some warmer air basically up to the Kansas-Nebraska line and generate some thunderstorm activity. And then on Monday, we see this trough broaden out. Another piece of energy starts to shoot out into our region, but the main surface low looks like it will form somewhere into eastern South Dakota, and this will generate widespread heavy precipitation across northern South Dakota, North Dakota, and isolated in northern Nebraska. And then on Tuesday, this trough starts to deepen and starts to move a little bit toward the east. Another low pressure system ejects out in southeastern Colorado, and then there'll be another one in west central portions of Wyoming. This leads to moisture across eastern Nebraska, south central and southeastern Nebraska. And then on Wednesday, we now start to see this trough starting to open up. We see one more low pressure developing as it pushes out of this trough in the upper atmosphere at the surface in northeastern Colorado. Therefore, we would expect precipitation once again to eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, and points to the north. And then rapidly it starts to move up into the upper plains region as we go into Thursday. Very strong low pressure system forms underneath of this trough, and we are looking at widespread heavy precipitation potential and probably some flooding issues to deal with in South Dakota before this trough moves over to the Great Lakes region on Friday, brings a northwest flow on the backside of it, so we will see some cooler conditions start to work into the high plains region, including Nebraska, as we get toward the end of the week. Major heavy precipitation in the upper Great Lakes region, and behind this there does look to be some frost that will develop as far south as the upper peninsula of Michigan. Further out, if we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, it takes us from next Thursday through the following Tuesday. Once that trough passes, we start to see ridging taking place into our region, and we see much warmer conditions developing. And with another trough moving in, we're going to start to see moisture ejecting out into our region, and will give us another shot of above normal moisture. We stay drier in the southeast. Further out, there are indications that some cooler air will start to work in as we get to the third week of September, but at this point in time, no frost is observed for the western Corn Belt. So Troy, overall, looks like a very rough weekend in terms of scattered precipitation, and then things start to dry out as we get to the end of next week.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, how long is the average fully grown sugar beet? The answer is C. It's a foot long. Nebraska ranks 6th in U.S. sugar beet production, and 90% of sugar beets in the state are grown in the Panhandle. Good to know. Next up, and just as the summer is winding down, things were recently heating up at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center near Meade. Dr. Stevan Knezevic recently hosted a workshop to showcase the advantages of flame weeding in an organic operation. It gives attendees the opportunity to learn how to control over 10 major Midwestern weeds in crops like sweet corn, popcorn, soybeans, and sorghum. Today, Bill Dodd is taking a closer look, along with some updates on the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's TAPS competition. Bill, what have you got your eye on this week?
Thanks, Troy. According to the 2019 Organic Trade Association Industry Survey released earlier this spring, organic food sales made up about 5.7% of overall U.S. food sales. Now, organic product sales have been increasing year to year over the last decade, and with no signs of the market slowing down, more efficient and environmental friendly management practices are taking center stage with many organic producers. In recent years, many organic farmers have ranked weeds as their #1 problem. Hand weeding had been one of the most popular physical methods of weed control in previous years. However, this practice isn't very cost-effective for many producers. Furthermore, it's been shown that repeated cultivation can increase the odds of soil erosion while promoting new patches of weeds in a field. Enter Stevan Knezevic, professor of agronomy and horticulture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. With a classroom full of eager minds, Knezevic is mindful of the fact that this is not the end-all be-all of weed management, as he begins to lay out the how, why, and benefits behind weed flaming as a tool for producers.
There's a lot of people out there who thought a Roundup was a silver bullet, or apparently, even though it's a great chemical, the way we used it, how much we used it, we basically run it to the ground, and it's not a silver bullet anymore. Now we have new technology that also has some issues. has some issues. So this is just another tool in the toolbox. I'm not telling people that, hey, flaming is going to solve all of your problems. Absolutely not. You know, it's just going to be a tool in the toolbox. And so far, over the last 10 years or so, I've been working primarily with the organic guys who really like to use this tool. And these 40-some people who are here at the workshop today, they're all organic guys. We do have actually a few conventional guys that farm you know, over 1,000 acres, and they actually have a 12-row unit, and they have issues with some of the glyphosate-resistant palmer and water hemp, and they're actually using flaming as one of the tools in the toolbox. So.
While flaming can be an efficient and cost-effective tool for organic producers, Stevan tells me the biggest takeaway he wanted people to get from this workshop was that participants come away with the knowledge to perform this management practice safely and efficiently.
The biggest takeaway from this workshop is that these organic guys, they need another tool in their toolbox. Most of them are working with cultivation, they're working with all kinds of mechanical means, they are doing hand weeding, which is very expensive. You know, hand weeding can cost easily a couple hundred bucks an acre. For $10 an acre, it's not a brainer to use flaming, even though if you buy a machine and all that. So we want to show them that this tool exists and you know, teach them how to do it properly, because flaming is very effective and it's relatively easy to use in grassy type crops like different types of corn and sorghum. But for soybean and sunflower, you have to really know what you're doing. So that's where we teach here. We show them the growth stages of soybean and sunflower development. And there are stages where you should be able to go in and flame without any problem. Other stages, if you flame, then you can hurt the crop.
Now, we can't talk too much about flaming without hearing a bit about irrigation and UNL's TAPS competitions. For those who aren't too familiar, TAPS stands for Testing Ag Performance Solutions. This is an innovative program created by UNL research extension specialists and educators. The competition facilitates numerous real-world farm management competitions that gathers UNL educators and researchers with producers, ag students, industry leaders, among others. As a network focused on increasing production profitability, the competition provides a low-risk environment to give participants the ability to test a variety of tactics and technologies. Over the last couple of years, the TAPS competitions have focused on sprinkler-irrigated corn under variable rate sprinkler irrigation systems administered from the West Central Research and Education Center in North Platte, Nebraska. While the most recent competition introduced subsurface drip irrigation systems, one big advantage to this competition is that TAPS farm management allows existing SDI producers to evaluate their management strategies against their peers and university recommendations. It also provides opportunities for producers interested in adopting an SDI system to familiarize themselves and learn how to manage it prior to adopting their practice on their own operation. In other words, it gives producers the ability to test the functionality of new systems and practices without betting the farm. Now moving into its third year, the competition is gaining momentum with several eager participants.
Talking with Colby Gardine out of EcoDrip, we talked about maybe using TAPS as a way to introduce SDI, introduce it, and then also provide an opportunity for people to play around and manage it before jumping in and making that investment, right? And so with that being said, EcoDrip donated an SDI system for our competition, and from that we have 16 teams competing in this year. So we like to think that there is value across all interested participants, both growers, regulatory agency, commodity boards, as well as ag service providers. So on a grower perspective, we look at it as two different ways. One, if somebody's interested in kind of vetting their management philosophies and strategies and to see how it compares against some of their peers. And then the alternative way to look at it is it gives an opportunity in a no-risk environment to try something new, try something that you otherwise might not want to try on your own operation.
With the success of the TAPS competitions, the program is again expanding with a new competition. The latest contest will be conducted near Sidney, Nebraska, and will feature winter wheat. Much like previous competitions, there will be a cash prize for the most profitable, highest input use efficiency, and highest yield. And 20 teams will be selected to compete, with participants making multiple farm management decisions, including selecting crop insurance, seed rating, nutrient management, and grain marketing, among others. If you're interested in competing in the first ever winter wheat competition or sponsoring the contest, you can reach out to the program coordinator, Crystal Rhodes, at crystal.rhodes@unl.edu. And Troy, that's what I've got my eye on this week. We'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Bill. Ending our show today, if debt on the farm has you stressed out, then maybe you can take some comfort in knowing you aren't alone. New data from the USDA shows U.S. farmers are carrying more debt now than at any point in the last 30 years. This is through a combination of short-term debt, like a loan for farm equipment, and long-term debt, like a 30-year land loan. Some good news, though, is that interest rates are low compared to historical averages. Ag economist Jim Jansen joined me to explain more.
The chart published by the USDA Economic Research Service displays two types of information. One is the type of debt in the United States for the ag sector, and two is the interest expenses from that. What the USDA did in that chart, the Economic Research Service put debt in parity, meaning they adjusted for inflation over time. So when we're looking at debt over time, yes, we might have higher levels of debt, but you also have to take into account inflation. So in taking into account inflation, in real terms, we are now at the highest point in ag level debts across the United States we've been in the last 30 years. And we also have interest debt that goes along with that. Interest remains relatively low right now. Some policymakers are looking at the Federal Reserve, short-term interest rates, what direction might those be headed. This is a time where we might see some folks shifting short-term debt, say for example, high balances on a line of credit or a revolving line of credit, and shifting that to more stationary debt such as an ag land loan, something of that nature. It's okay to do these things, but we need to keep in mind when we are shifting debt around, make sure, one, to be financing it possibly maybe for a fixed amount, 6.5%, 5.5%, whatever the ag land loans you might qualify for, but also being prudent when we do move forward in future years, because we are in a period right now where prices have fluctuated some. There's obviously been challenges for many producers across the state of Nebraska with the weather-related events, and taking all these factors into account, this is the time when we can still get resources and use them when necessary.
We've posted more on this topic on the Market Journal website. Well, that's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, gypsum may be more commonly associated with plaster and drywall, but its use in agriculture can increase yields and improve soil. Plus, you've heard us talk about using cover crops during the off-season, but what about while you're growing corn? We'll look at how interseeding might work for you. All that and more. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.